Imagine a land of flat plains and winding rivers, where sunrise casts light across the ancient Tigris. In the north of Mesopotamia, under blue skies and beside fertile banks, lies the city of Ashur. Its name meant more than just place. It carried the weight of a becoming empire. But in the beginning, Ashur was modest, just one of many cities along two rivers that gave life to Mesopotamia. Trade caravans passed through its gates. Fishermen harvested from the Tigris. Families worshipped a singular god, Ashur, both city and spirit, guiding their rhythms. This city belonged to merchants and farmers, scribes and priests, weathering floods and dust storms, while rulers rose and fell to their south. For centuries, Assyria remained quiet. Its people traded tin for silver in Anatolia, transported textiles and livestock, and exchanged ideas across hills and deserts. They learned from the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Sumerians, especially how power worked, how kings ruled, how empires formed. Hidden in that quiet was ambition. Beneath the city walls, under temple stones, a seed was planted, that Assyria could become more than a waypoint. It could become destiny. And one day, it would. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Ashur was no longer just a humble city on the Tigris. Something was shifting. Trade had made it wealthy. Its people were skilled. Its god, Ashur, was now more than a local deity. He was beginning to take on the shape of a national god, one who would one day travel with armies and be worshipped far beyond his original home. This was when the first Assyrian rulers began calling themselves kings. Their titles were modest at first, governors, representatives of Ashur, but over time, those titles grew in weight. The city's leaders saw opportunity in the chaos around them. Neighboring powers rose and fell. Babylon was struggling. The Hittites had already faded into memory, and the Amorites, once strong, were beginning to lose their grip. So Assyria did what so many rising powers do. It filled the space left behind. The kings of this era, men like Shamshi-Adad I, didn't just rule Ashur. They began to reach outward. Shamshi-Adad conquered lands to the west and north, building a network of cities that answered to him. He set up sons in distant capitals and carved out a short-lived empire from the patchwork of northern Mesopotamia. It didn't last forever. After Shamshi-Adad's death, his mini-empire crumbled. But the idea had been planted, that Assyria was more than a city, that it could rule others, that it could one day stand above. And as generations passed, that idea refused to die. As the centuries rolled on, Assyria didn't fade into the background. It waited, it watched, and when the time was right, it struck. By the 14th century BCE, the Assyrians were ready to rise again, this time with sharper edges. This era is known as the Middle Assyrian period, and it marked a serious turning point. The Assyrians transformed from regional players into a true imperial force. They were no longer content with just defending their borders. They wanted to push them further. One of the early kings of this time, Ashurbanipal I, threw off foreign control and declared full independence. He didn't just want to survive. He wanted Assyria to be feared, to be remembered. And that's exactly what started happening. He went to war, took cities, and claimed land. Suddenly, neighboring states like the Mitanni realized they had a serious problem. Over the next few generations, Assyria became more organized and more ruthless. They built better armies. They trained harder. They expanded their cities and filled their temples with offerings. Their leaders weren't just kings. They were warriors. Their job wasn't just to rule, but to conquer. One of the most important of these warrior kings was Tukulti-Ninurta I. He marched his troops all the way into Babylon, even sacked the city, and dragged its king back to Assyria. It was a bold, brutal move, and it sent a clear message to the rest of Mesopotamia. The Assyrians were not playing games. They ruled through fear, but also through structure. They built roads, developed efficient administration, and sent governors to control conquered lands. But rebellion was always waiting. And each time the Assyrians crushed a revolt, they became a little harder, a little colder. And yet, even after all that expansion, their empire didn't last forever. By the 11th century BCE, Assyria faced trouble again: famine, civil war, and attacks from tribes along their borders. For a time, they shrank, they withdrew. But Assyria was not finished, not even close. Because what came next was the most powerful, the most terrifying version of Assyria the world had ever seen. Out of the ashes of decline, the Assyrians returned stronger than ever. Around the 10th century BCE, they began carving out something new, something more ambitious. This was the birth of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and it would become one of the most powerful empires the ancient world had ever seen. At the heart of this revival was Ashurbanipal II, a king who didn't just expand borders, he reinvented how Assyria projected its power. His campaigns were relentless. He marched westward, crushing resistance, taking tribute, and building fear. But he also focused on more than war. He moved the capital to Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, and turned it into a symbol of imperial strength, filled with massive palaces, towering statues, and detailed wall carvings that proudly displayed his victories. These images weren't just decoration, they were warnings. Then came Shalmaneser III, who took his father's ambitions even further. He fought over 30 campaigns, clashing with kingdoms across the Near East. Tribes and cities submitted, not just out of admiration, but out of fear of what would happen if they didn't. The strength of the Assyrian army was unmatched. Well-trained, disciplined, and equipped with siege engines, chariots, and iron weapons, they could break walls, scatter armies, and turn cities to rubble. But their real genius was in how they ruled. The Assyrians perfected the system of provinces. They placed loyal officials to govern local populations, demanded taxes, and deported rebellious groups. This was more than control, it was transformation. Conquered lands became Assyrian in name, culture, and administration. Yet, the most iconic phase of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was still ahead. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, the empire didn't just dominate Mesopotamia. It spread across the ancient world, from the Persian Gulf to Egypt. And at its heart was a new idea, that the Assyrian king was not just a ruler. He was chosen by the gods to bring order to the world, even if that order came at the edge of a blade. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had reached the height of its power. It wasn't just a kingdom anymore, it was an unstoppable machine, a superpower of its age. At the center of this golden era was Tiglath-Pileser III, a king who didn't just lead armies, he rebuilt the very structure of the empire. He reorganized the military, making it more efficient and permanent. He reduced the power of local nobles and introduced a centralized system that reported directly to the crown. Provinces were redrawn, rebellious regions were crushed quickly, and people were moved across the empire to break up resistance and dilute local identities. It wasn't gentle, but it worked. After him, Sargon II pushed the empire even further. He defeated powerful coalitions, expanded into Anatolia, and established a brand new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, a city built from scratch that reflected imperial ambition in every stone. His death in battle didn't slow things down. His son, Sennacherib, took over and immediately left his mark on history. Sennacherib is best known for destroying Babylon in a dramatic and violent campaign. The city had rebelled too many times, and he decided to wipe it from the map. This act shocked the ancient world. But he also turned Nineveh into a magnificent capital, complete with vast canals, towering walls, and palaces that showcased Assyrian power and artistry. Later came Esarhaddon, who marched south and conquered Egypt, bringing it under Assyrian control for a time. Then Ashurbanipal, the last great king, expanded the empire even more and created one of the most impressive achievements of Assyrian culture, the Library of Ashurbanipal. With thousands of clay tablets collected from across the empire, this library preserved myths, records, and science, much of which might have otherwise been lost forever. At this point, Assyria seemed invincible. Its armies were everywhere, its cities were rich, its culture was dominant. But underneath the surface, cracks had started to form, cracks that even the strongest walls couldn't hold back forever. The neo-Assyrian Empire stood taller than any before it, but at its greatest height, it was also at its most vulnerable. Behind the victories and monuments, something was changing. The very strategies that had built the empire, harsh conquests, mass deportations, crushing taxation, were starting to create deep unrest. After Ashurbanipal's death around 627 BCE, the cracks widened. There was no clear successor. Civil war erupted. Brothers and generals fought for control. Provinces that once feared the Assyrian name began to test their limits. And with the central power weakened, enemies that had once been kept at bay started gathering strength. In the east, the Medes were rising. In the south, the Babylonians had not forgotten the destruction of their city. Led by Nabopolassar, they declared independence and began striking north. Former vassals turned rivals. Assyria, for all its past strength, now stood alone, exhausted by years of war, rebellion, and internal conflict. Nineveh, the mighty capital built by Sennacherib and expanded by Ashurbanipal, faced threats from every side. The walls were thick, the armies still large, but morale was low, and the empire no longer had the unity it once relied on. And then, in 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. A coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians laid siege to Nineveh. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but after months of fighting, the walls were breached. The city that had symbolized Assyrian dominance for a century burned. Palaces crumbled. Statues were smashed. The library of Ashurbanipal was buried in ash and debris. With Nineveh's fall, the empire collapsed like a dying star. Assyrian resistance continued for a few more years, clinging to life in places like Haran, but the momentum was gone. By 609 BCE, the Assyrian Empire, once feared from Egypt to Iran, was no more. The fall of the Assyrian Empire was sudden, violent, and total. Its cities lay in ruins, its kings forgotten, and for centuries, the world barely remembered their name. The Babylonians and Medes divided their territory. New powers rose, but what the Assyrians built, destroyed, and wrote was not lost forever. Beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, archaeologists in the 19th century began to uncover something astonishing. Vast palaces filled with intricate reliefs, massive sculptures of winged bulls, and thousands of clay tablets. These weren't simple ruins. These were traces of a people who had once ruled the Near East with brilliance and brutality. The discovery of the library of Ashurbanipal changed everything. Among the tablets were epics, medical texts, prayers, omens, windows into a lost world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known piece of literature, was found there. Suddenly, the Assyrians weren't just conquerors. They were storytellers, scribes, and thinkers. Today, the story of Assyria stands as one of rise, dominance, and collapse. It was a civilization that burned brightly, sometimes too brightly. It left behind not just destruction, but lessons about power, resilience, cruelty, and culture. And while its cities may lie in dust, its legacy echoes through history, in texts, in ruins, and in the memories of a world they once shaped.